welcome to the HowGood Innovation Online series. I'm Ethan Soloviev, Chief Innovation Officer at HowGood. Today we are joined by Juan Lucas Restrepo, the Director General of the Alliance of Bioversity International, and CIAT, which is part of the larger CGIAR International Agriculture Research Facility. A quick outline of today is that Juan Lucas and I will have a conversation. There'll be some interactive community breakouts and then a Q&A. Also just want to point your attention to some upcoming talks that we have. We're going to meet with Melanie Allen from the Decolonizing Wealth Project to take a very different kind of angle and approach on biodiversity and agriculture. And then we have the esteemed Syed Azam Ali from Crops for the Future, who I believe is actually on the call with us today, which is great. I'm sure I'll have some great questions from him. We're speaking with him in November about underutilized crops and planetary health. And then a little bit later in December, we'll be joined by Mary Jane Melendez from General Mills. She's the Chief Sustainability Officer and head of their corporate foundation, talking about business as a force for good, and also sharing a bit about regenerative agriculture and biodiversity and what General Mills as a large private food company is doing in this space. So I hope you will join us for all of those and share the word. And I'm going to pass it over to Juan Lucas. Welcome. And if you would be willing to, just introduce yourself, tell us a bit about this Bioversity CIAT Alliance, and then we'll dive in.
All right, Ethan. I think it's a great opportunity to be together in this group, using this HowGood channel to discuss about the business in the future, sustainability, and all these linkages that are really complex between agriculture, food, nutrition, the environment, etc. As you said, the director and in charge of integrating these two very traditional and wonderful research organizations. I've been on the job for more than a year and a half. And my background has been agricultural policy. I've been working most of my life in Colombia, looking a lot deeper into coffee, into cocoa, into being part of the Ministry of Agriculture, etc. So my view on all of these things, having been a public servant for a while, is understanding really how civil society, governments, and the private sector can have a conversation and really identify pathways to get us to a very different status and equilibrium that's putting a lot of pressure on how we live now and how we will live in the future. So it's great to be in this conversation to discuss about all of this, as there's many things happening at this moment. There's many conversations that we need to integrate and understand in a more holistic manner.
And maybe you could just say a bit about the larger CGIAR, and I think there are multiple different research centers, and there's been some coming together. So just give us a picture of that and help us understand what's unique about this alliance, what's unique about Bioversity International in your work.
No, it's a great question actually, because there is a lot of change happening at those two levels. The CGIAR is composed currently of 15 independent, related. It's like a club, like a social club, very autonomous but connected centers that share policies, share some services, a common strategy and mission. But now we are entering a completely new era where we have agreed as centers to give, away some of our autonomy and governance into a new system, CGIAR system board, that's also part of all the boards of all of our centers, and empowering an executive management team, a system organization, to really allow these 15 units to start operating in a more cohesive manner, lowering transaction costs and enhancing our partnership. So so what CIAT and Bioversity have done is kind of, and we feel very proud about this, kind of led the way into what's happening at a larger scale in the CGIAR. And the other very interesting thing is that we are very well recognized in many positive ways because we've been behind the green revolution. So when 50, 60 years ago, when there was a big threat of how to address hunger. Well, these centers were critical in the Green Revolution, but we are not there anymore. We have solved and helped resolve, increasing the calories available, bringing down their price. But now our challenges are totally different because the landscape is different. There's a lot of negative externalities. So the system, the CGIAR, is also thinking forward into becoming a champion in international public goods out of our research to really help transform food, land, and water systems in the future. So it's going to be a very different business to what we've been doing traditionally.
Excellent. And yeah, so important to be focusing on biodiversity, in that context. Some of the green revolution, as you said, achieved significantly more calories available, but perhaps, as you said, sometimes at the cost of agricultural biodiversity and biodiversity in general. And so to swing the pendulum back the other way seems important. And then, of course, all of a sudden, we've been struck by COVID. We have a sudden, unexpected, well, some expected it, but mostly, for most people, unexpected global pandemic. And so I'd be very interested to hear, how are you thinking about it? In what way is the COVID crisis also a food systems crisis? What is the linkages there? And then what does biodiversity have to do with that?
Well, we hear every day about this COVID crisis, not only from the sanitary dimension and all the disease and the deaths and all these, terrible events, but we hear a lot about the economies, how they are, being shattered across, the private sector, government, fiscal numbers, etc. And what that is implying in many other things. So we are seeing, for example, that there is less carbon emissions. Historically, we haven't. So there is a lot of changes, a lot of trade-offs. We're becoming more virtual. We're probably accelerating a lot of trends that where we were supposed to be more virtual in 10 years. Now we are doing this kind of events as we speak. So we need to understand what that means for the food systems, what that means for biodiversity. And given we are entering an era of reconstructing many things post-COVID, kind of follow what the OECD has been saying, a real build back better. There is the incentives are not there. Many of us would like to see us go back to the equilibrium that existed before COVID. And we see that given there's going to be so much investment in recovery, that if we help redirect that investment to reach a different equilibrium with more harmony between food, health, nutrition, the environment, we would really be taking a significant step forward for a better society. And of course, biodiversity and this, this crisis that's happening over like the kind of the fifth mass extinction, that's more and more, there's more and more evidence of that. Well, we need to break the neck of that and really protect the, the little biodiversity that we still have as a society to, to foresee a better future for us and for our relatives, for our society in general.
Definitely, yeah. And it seems like, some research has pointed to unhealthy diets and poor nutrition as one of the significant factors in mortality resulting from COVID. And so it seems like there's an opportunity to be thinking about and addressing that at the same time of sort of increasing the diversity of the food, increasing the nutrition of the food. And maybe that won't help immediately in COVID, but it will help to work on what's to come if there are more pandemics. And so I'm just curious if you could speak a little bit more about that link between human health and biodiversity.
Okay, well, there is a paper that's making a lot of noise and a lot of people are reading, that came out in September in Nature. One of the authors works in our alliance, which is about bending the curve of biodiversity loss. And it brings a lot of secondary information, a lot of other studies to develop a number of scenarios. And a lot of those scenarios are quite negative. So, having a better, balance, or a biodiversity balance in the future is not kind of foreseeable, but we can reach, put a bottom to that and start a recovery in a couple of decades if we transform food systems. So food systems transformation, the way we produce and we consume foods, will be absolutely critical. And of course, it's to recover and to safeguard biodiversity, but that will have a very, going to your question, positive effect in health as well. As part of the problem nowadays is that the current food system that's kind of too homogeneous with very little biodiversity as part of it is related more and more to unhealthy lives, to non-communicable diseases, heart disease, etc., clearly associated with the food that our humanity is consuming at the moment.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking about you've spoken in many arenas about the sort of post 2020 global biodiversity framework, and doing some of this work that you're talking about of seeing how interrelated food and biodiversity are. So yeah, I'm just curious, and I think even yesterday you were in a meeting working on this. So I'm very curious to hear what's happening at a global scale. You're involved in these very high level conversations. What's happening about creating this next biodiversity framework? Yeah, tell us a bit about that.
Okay, well, we in the Alliance are kind of strange animals in this conversation because, we have developed institutions at the multilateral level, especially that are perfect silos. So you have, the climate conversation and its specific convention going one way, and you have the climate one, and all the discussions about agriculture, where it's going, etc., have different venues. And we have the absolute clarity that we need to break those silos. And there is this conversation happening, which is the negotiation among parties. Most countries of the world are members of or parts of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and they are negotiating the new round of targets for the post-2020 framework. And it's great because usually that was a conservation of conservationists, environmentalists that were only concerned, which is super important, about safeguarding whatever is left of natural environments, preserves, parks, etc. But they now understand that biodiversity needs to be assessed also looking at agricultural landscapes, urban landscapes, etc. So we are seeing that discussion is already involving a lot of discussion of food, regenerative agriculture, restoration, a lot of elements that were part of the discussions in other silos. So we're very excited about this one. What the Alliance is doing is we are part of that discussion. We are not a party, but we're just a research organization that's been able to connect with the Secretariat, with a number of member states, feeding them information and evidence to help that negotiation be successful in terms of acknowledging that the solution involves transforming food systems. And this hopefully also feeds into next years, by the end of the year, UN Food System Summit. So the UN Food System Summit is not only, okay, let's talk about food, but it's food in a climate crisis, in an environmental crisis, and really addressing food systems transformation in a holistic manner. So and I'm kind of seeing the glass full. We're starting to see a lot of integrative work where these bodies understand that they will not meet their goals without influencing and promoting change across other silos or other sectors.
And maybe that's part of, I mean, and I haven't researched it as deeply as you have, but I think that the previous IHE convention and the targets that were set, my recollection is that many of those targets were not hit. And maybe some of it is because of what you're explaining about the silos. And so, yeah, I'm just curious, like, how is everybody thinking about that? And is everybody saying, well, how can we do it better this time? How can we either set more realistic targets, or can we just up our ambition and our execution to actually achieve the targets that we set? How is that playing into, this next round of a global biodiversity framework?
Well, it's not only what happens at a global discussion, but what happens at the community, local level, and what happens in governments. And we're seeing, for example, Costa Rica is a great example of how the ministries of agriculture and environment work as a pack. They are work really closely. They assess the trade-offs. They understand, the costs, the benefits of different interventions, and they agree on a pathway on a middle ground. And it's starting to happen. And as we see, that the Ministry of Environment is not only about safeguarding, but promoting a recovery and promoting, giving incentives to the industry, to business, etc., to change how they produce, how they participate in value chains, etc. That's where change happens. It doesn't happen at the global level, but the global level reflects what's happening below and gives us, clear signals. And as those targets, the new round of targets, are very well crafted, very clear to understand across society, and then to monitor in terms of progress, then those targets will, be more of use and importance that the IKE targets that, very early on the game, people started saying, oh, well, those targets, forget about them. They are impossible. They are too costly. They did not consult me, etc., etc. So they were kind of undermined.
And I mean, you were starting to speak to this here, but could you say a little about the role of the private sector in this context, and of, helping to achieve, and of, like you were saying, being involved in the conversations? But yeah, what can companies, what can corporations do to actually help move in a positive direction on biodiversity?
Well, there is the passive and the proactive possibilities. So if it's the passive, it means you are a latecomer to this very rapidly changing game, and you will basically abide as rules change, or you will just lose your market share because you did not foresee that the system was changing. So that's what may happen with a business as usual approach. On the other side, and across landscapes and across value chains, there is growing evidence. The evidence is there. It's in papers, it's in the universities, it's in policies, etc. That's starting to show different ways to do business across the food system. And talking about agrobiodiversity, and which has been kind of our core mandate for a while, there is a lot of evidence that the current homogeneous food system, that only, that 70% of the, crop landscape is covered by 9 crops only. That's not necessarily, well, it's feeding, yes, but it's not producing new opportunities for the business. It's kind of stalling. It's kind of and it's creating, and it has created a lot of pressure, because there is a lot also of market power and strong players that, kind of squeeze the business across the value chain, etc. And as we try to reverse this with good science through, bringing back a more diversified landscape, and diversified in both of the crops and animals that are present in that landscape, but also understanding microorganisms and all the linkages with plants and trees and shrubs, we can make this as complex as possible. There is not only a lot of new business opportunities coming out of that diversification, but there is a lot of opportunity in terms of equity and in terms of social justice. So looking just at the example of crops, there are many quinoas out there. Quinoa is a great success story. It has some black elements, that it's not fully perfect, but relying on on an indigenous crop of the Peruvian and Bolivian and Colombian Andes that's originated from there, and devising a new value chain for and a new cereal that people are really consuming, and it's becoming part of a healthy diet, especially across the young generations. There is many of those quinoas around. There is fonio that's lagging a little bit, but it's starting to catch up. And I remember when I was a kid, when I arrived from school, they gave me a piece of chachafruto cake, and chachafruto is an amazing, beautiful legume tree with beans like this size. Amazing. That is a great a source of protein that we stopped seeing. So we relied on many more species 100 years ago to feed ourselves. A lot of them, unfortunately, have been lost. But given all this work of gene banking and wild relatives preservation and working with communities, there is a lot of inputs also to use at the base a wider number of crops that mean opportunity for business, and also mean opportunity, especially for small and the poorest farmers, to participate in the food system in a different way as they do today. That's just one example, but we can go into the opportunities for business in regenerative agriculture and in agroecological pathways and in intensive sustainable intensification, and the digital, and well, there's great opportunities as the food system gets this pressure to change itself.
That's excellent. Yeah, and I'd like to go there. There was a question from the audience that you were just touching a little bit, but maybe you could go deeper to differentiate a bit between food and nutrient-dense food, and the role that biodiversity has to play in not just producing a lot more calories, but in actually enhancing the nutrient diversity and nutrient density of what the people of the world are eating.
Yeah, the thing, Ethan, is that humanity now is facing, this big number of hidden hunger. About 2 billion people that, yes, they don't go to bed feeling hungry, but they go to bed malnourished, and meaning they lack or vitamins or minerals or a more balanced intake to really help them with a healthier life. So they maybe are depressed and they get sick very often, and they are kind of slow, they lack energy, etc. So one of the things we need to do as we push for food systems transformation is to make sure that those crops that get into your plate not only are efficient in how they draw environmental and rely on environmental resources, but they're efficient as well on a per unit basis, call that unit whatever, on being energy rich, micronutrient dense, etc. And there's many tools to do that. You can work in biofortification that up to some point could help the staple crops that will be there for a long time and will be very important in the future, to change them a little bit. So your maize, a part of your diet is maize that's enriched and that also within that crop can rely on a much larger part of its gene pool than today. Maize is only using a tiny fraction of all the diversity, the genetic diversity of maize. So we need to start providing incentives to look out there what is there in genetic diversity and make sure that is brought into research and helps meet that goal of nutrient-rich density in what people get. And there is
Yeah.
one other element that's kind of the excuse for not doing a lot of this, which is affordability. Because if we think about this great diet that people in Europe can afford, but most of the population that lives under $3 a day cannot, we're not solving anything. We need to make sure that those novel foods, the opportunities, etc., are there to feed the poorest. Otherwise, the incentives will not be there, and we would not have accomplished anything.
Yeah, and I mean, it's very interesting to go back to companies, and what you're really speaking about here is agrobiodiversity and the importance of that agrobiodiversity in the food system. And I want to go and talk a bit about the agrobiodiversity index that the Alliance has created, because it's very exciting, powerful set of data. And maybe as a segue into that, there was a question from the audience that's about how do we not only make sure that the research is happening on these crops, make sure that it's starting to change for companies and the farming system, but how do we actually communicate that to the public, to the billions of people in the world who are making food decisions? And I'm curious if Bioversity, if the Alliance is doing any work more on that, communicating to the public about biodiversity and agrobiodiversity, or where do you think the greatest opportunities, who can really do that work the best? And then let's kind of lead back to the index from there.
Okay, no, going there for a second. The CIAT and Bioversity were two drops in the ocean. Now that we're together, we're kind of a bathtub in the ocean. We're a little bit larger, but we're still very small in relation to what needs to happen to make noise and to communicate, etc. So we need to understand that it's not our communication, but really how to use our scarce resources in conversations such as the one I mentioned with the CBD, in how, and we have an upcoming conversation in a few days. I'm not gonna say with who, but if we convince that who, that to start influencing the UN Food System Summit. So agrobiodiversity is not a stream of the summit, but something that cuts across all the streams related to consumption, production, waste, etc. Oh my, I think we can achieve a lot even being so small. So it's kind of what you need to do. Now, who is doing a better job than us? I saw last week the Alive on the Planet of 93-year-old Sir David Attenborough, an amazing movie. It's on Netflix, and it's his testimony of how we are facing this fifth biodiversity extinction. It's showcasing what happens if we maintain the current trajectories, and it looks really gloomy at some point. You get very depressed in this looking at this documentary, but then his clarity on the solutions and how they are not so complicated. Yes, they require political willingness, etc. But a few things that can be done as a societal agreement, and we might see something much better for ourselves in a few years' time. So there is many key people talking about this, and there is, of course, the young generations that will be electing presidents and that are super conscious about this. And for me, the biggest drivers of change in food systems will be consumers, and especially consumers from these young generations that are starting to say, well, how come my father had the opportunity to go out to the backyard and see these things that are not there anymore for me? So this is, I think, the biggest driver, and communicator will be this young generation.
Excellent. And so I very much agree with what you were talking about of, finding those players. They may be large companies, they may be small companies, but ones that can influence across political boundaries, and also many, at least the food producing companies that we work with, are the ones who are in touch with those younger generations, as you're speaking about. And so, part of how I met you and how we've started this this partnership between HowGood and Bioversity is through the Agrobiodiversity Index, because you've put together this incredible data set that's the most detailed in the world, to help understand agrobiodiversity. And we're seeking then to use that and put that into the hands of food producing companies, of product developers who are actually designing their products with the insights from this index. So I just wonder if you could tell us a bit about the Agrobiodiversity Index. How is it created? How does it work? And what are some of the ways that companies and even governments can make use of the index?
Sure, Ethan. This is a very exciting endeavor, and it's something that's flowing, and we got a very good number of scientists tweaking and calibrating and reinforcing this index, so it really meets this vision of, given what I said before, given there is clear evidence on how agrobiodiversity across value chains, across landscapes, is something that is means not only a need to have, but also opportunity for business. So we've been developing this set of indicators from these great databases using some artificial intelligence for data mining, etc., where we can really assess in an objective manner what is the status. So we can provide a baseline. For example, what's the agrobiodiversity status in Italy or in Kenya? And we did last year, we launched an example of 10 countries where we already said, okay, in these dimensions, this country is doing better than this one, etc. And those comparisons are sometimes not nice, but are super important. Then we can also understand commitment for companies, for example, in their policies, in their mandates, in their social reports, etc. Do they care about this or not? So we can capture that and say, okay, is there commitment? And maybe the company is not there, but it's clearly going to that direction. And then measuring progress as well. So, okay, actually, this is what happened. This was what was achieved, and in an objective manner, because sometimes agrobiodiversity is something that sounds great, but it's very difficult to measure, and we've taken important steps forward to be able to do that, and that can be applied at different scales, countries, industries, value chains, market segments, etc. And we're kind of going into the detail about how to move this in the future. One small example, part of this, and I was talking at the end of last year to the new Director General of FAO, this should be kind of the new statistics from the Statistics Department on FAO on how to really, share information on what's happening at the country level. Some of the information is more suited to use at the industry or business sector. So there's a lot of potential that we're working on.
So you could look at a country, you could look at Colombia, or you could look at the US, and you could use this agrobiodiversity index, which has data on soils, it's got data on tree cover, and has data on cropping systems, and you could produce a sort of an assessment or even a rating or ranking of how good is this country and the agriculture here doing on agrobiodiversity. Is that right? You could do it for a country. Could you also do it for a company or for a single crop?
Yeah, even for a sourcing, from a procurement standpoint, for example. So the indicators and the databases can be easily adapted to different conditions. So we can sit down with a small company that says, okay, I'm a little bit concerned because I'm not, my supply chain is failing me. I don't know whether to maintain it and work on it, or where is there opportunity to source my inputs from a more, from a source that's really managing things as it should. Those kind of assessments can be done.
Excellent. And so could you use it, something that comes up for me is one of the drivers of biodiversity degradation is sometimes the agricultural practices, it's sometimes the crops that are being grown, but sometimes what's driving that is actually the investors that are actually, the big banks, the institutional investment funds that are investing in a commodities company or investing in a specialized ingredients company. So is there a way that the agrobiodiversity index could help them assess their investments or assess their portfolio or do due diligence on a potential investment?
That's our hope, and that's, I'm super convinced that that's what will happen. The problem is when it will happen, because of course these big funds, banks, etc., are still invested on the oil and gas industry, and they are still invested in the big, companies that move forward, staples, etc. So they also have a cost of changing, of shifting, but they are already seeing that and seeing how they develop this new wave of carbon or green indexes and start incorporating biodiversity, or even more so agrobiodiversity, as one of their elements to rate investments and to promote or demote growth in a specific industry or business practice.
Got it. There's a question from the participants here that's asking what the index focuses on. Is it only commodity? Is it only the top 10 plants, corn and wheat and soy, or are there many different species of plants that it can look at and track?
No, it covers everything. It actually can, for that, responding to that question, monitor a specific territory and see how homogeneous, if it's one crop territory, a big soy landscape, for to give an example, would get a very low rating, and we could say no, that's a landscape that's really incorporating a higher number of crops, etc. We can monitor that, and there is some of that through databases that we are interpreting through soil health. So there is proxies from our scientists on how to exactly assess that. Is this landscape more or less agrobiodiverse in many elements and layers?
Yeah. I mean, as we've worked with it at HowGood, we've seen that there's a huge diversity of data. It's geospatial, so you can look at a whole country or a state in a country, or even go down to sometimes an individual farm level, and you can see things like what is the percentage of agricultural tree cover, or what is the percentage of a natural habitat that's been safeguarded in this landscape. You can even look and say, what is the diversity of crops in this landscape? Not just your main crop, whether that's, avocados or soy or cacao, but how many other crops are also being grown in that landscape. And all that is on top of, measurements of soil biodiversity that are drawn together from a number of different sources. So you can really see from the micro to the macro, a large amount about agrobiodiversity. And there's another talk that in this series where myself and our research director here, we lay out these 8 different levels of biodiversity and talk about how you can assess across each of them. And basically what we found is this agrobiodiversity index is the most comprehensive and complete, from that very fine level of soil biodiversity all the way, up until the genetic and the crop and the ingredient, even like we were talking about, some of the landscape diversity.
Exactly. So it's more than number of species, but it's more complex. Let me give you one example, if I can, that's
Please.
related, and it's another opportunity. There is this important agreement from countries to plant billions of trees, and all the presidents are talking about it. Those that do not believe in climate change, those that do, they are kind of agreeing on, okay, we need to plant billions of trees. But the problem there from an agrobiodiversity dimension is if that is done by hiring a nursery that produces millions of clones of the same tree species and covering the landscape with only one tree and one clone, imagine what that does for biodiversity. So you need to incorporate agrobiodiversity, including tree species, into that. You need to identify the mix of biodiversity within a species that you can rely on, and also the mix of trees that you can bring together to really deploy something that's really going to solve better the problem. And this is just an example with trees, but this is our similarities with some agricultural options as well.
So you are welcome to type your questions into the chat, or there's a little thing, I believe, at the bottom of your screen. You can raise your hand, and then if there's time, we'll take you off mute and ask a question. I'm going to start with one from Lorenzo from earlier about the private sector and instruments such as CSR, corporate social responsibility practices. Can they be efficient enough to meet biodiversity needs? And then also, I think a really interesting part of this question is, can we help smaller businesses? Because agriculture is made up of often many smaller businesses. How can we support them to be adopting and sort of moving with these sort of CSR practices?
Okay, I think CSR was kind of a breakthrough in terms of business behavior and transparency and accountability in terms of responding to their communities in general a while ago. But I think we need to rethink CSR. CSR as it was defined in the past, it's now maybe too restrictive. Things have changed. There is a lot more knowledge, a lot more evidence about what needs to be part of real serious corporate responsibility besides your closer surrounding as a company. So I think an idea is just to start challenging the CSR and starting to see what's the reloaded CSR for companies. And in terms of the small business, I think small business are super fit to follow this trend that we're hearing a lot about, these shorter food chains. That this procurement, get your food closer to. It's not an anti-trade thing only, because of course there is always some noise related to that, but it's more rethinking procurement, value chains, making sure what you source as a company is something that's local and that it can be brought to school feeding, etc. So I see so many opportunities that a small company can tackle more effectively in a landscape than a large company that might not have the linkages, the relationships, etc. That large ones do. So I see huge space, not only for small businesses across the value chain, but also small farms, not too small, but small farms that are ready to transform, etc., and connect to these opportunities of shorter value chains. I think I see a lot of opportunity there as well.
Yeah, and I would just agree that CSR has got to evolve and evolve fast. And I think part of the Agrobiodiversity Index and some of the tools like the ones that HowGood is building allow a much more rapid response to changing conditions. You don't have to wait to compile a report at the end of the year. You can get live information about your supply chain, about your crops, really very quickly, and be communicating and even held accountable to changes in that much more quickly. So I think that the data, as you've talked about, will help CSR evolve. So we have a question here from Syed Azam Ali. So interesting. So it says, Earlier, you mentioned the consolidation of the CG system and how the alliance is a bit of a different model. Please advise on how the consolidation and role of specific commodity centers, rice, maize, can contribute to wider agrobiodiversity beyond their mandate crops.
I think it's a super interesting question. What I'm seeing, and of course this is on the works, so there is a lot of thought and still not a lot of the specific solutions, is that, as I said, we are gearing CGIAR for the greater challenges of the past, and our infrastructure is, very diverse and heterogeneous, and I see huge potential, not only for centers such as ours or alliances that are already, driven and working on consumer behavior and those kind of things that are important, but also for those centers that have had traditional mandates around key staple crops. First, because those will remain being super important. Second, because there is always new ways on how to sustainably produce those crops, and there is need for international public's good there. Third, because as I said before, usually those centers are also the trustees. They hold in trust these international gene banks that are absolutely critical to safeguard that agrobiodiversity. And we have so much value to unlock from those gene banks in terms of usage. So just to give you an example, the potatoes we see in the supermarket in comparison to those that SIP, the International Potato Center, holds, there are so many things to unlock in those collections of, native potatoes that have higher nutritional values and that can be used as such, or that can be brought into breeding programs. So there is still a lot of space for crop-centered centers.
Thank you. We've got a really fascinating question from Emily Lafferty, who works with she's working with a food manufacturer and is designing products. And so they're doing amazing work thinking about the place and the overall system instead of an individual crop. So they're building crop lists, she says, where there's proof of symbiosis of polycultures, of symbiosis between crops. She gives an example of coconut and jackfruit together, or be interesting in a temperate climate system. What else, she's asking from the point of view of a company manufacturing products, what else should they be thinking about as they're designing for agrobiodiversity? Are there particular lists that are out there, or like how do you get guidance to figure out what combinations, what ecosystems of crops should be designed into products?
Okay, no, I'm really happy that that's how you are addressing your business model. This mixed crops, agroforestry, combining species. It's not only plant but animals. I love these rice paddies where you have ducks and fish, and it's a symbiotic system where you don't have to apply agrochemicals. They're amazing new things that are being, and there is a lot of tension around this related to this agroecological transition that can work. So polycrops, mixed, etc., requires a lot of knowledge. But as robotics price goes down, as digital goes up, etc., that will also unlock the profitability of some of these more complex systems. The other thing is just to follow and piggyback on things that others have been doing, and this is normal. It's nothing wrong about this. There is one project from our alliance that has happened in a number of countries, and Brazil is an important one, which is called Biodiversity for Food and Nutrition. You can type in that name and Google it. And we've been actually assessing, for example, for Brazil, a number of indigenous species, local crops, minor crops that have been out there, and assessing their nutritional quality, and and starting to support, and even the government has been in the past following this through regulation, etc., for school feeding programs, for example, and how you can really use these lists, and you can see a huge list of plants that give it a look, and maybe you find something that's interesting. And then there is the work of other companies. So, for example, it was super interesting to see Unilever North's 50 future foods. When they work with the WWF and a couple of universities, etc., and say, okay, let's see how we diversify our sourcing for ingredients, and let's look into other cereals and mushrooms and algae, etc. And they devised this list. And my understanding, I don't know where they are at the moment, is that they are now understanding how they start promoting their sourcing, and they enhancing and getting producers to produce those novel foods, etc. So this is happening at many scales, and that's probably what allows me to be optimistic and see the glass half full.
Excellent. Well, we're close to the end of the time. I want to pass it back to you, Juan Lucas, if there's any kind of final comments you wanted to make, or angles we haven't covered as we wrap up here.
Well, maybe one last one, Ethan, and it's that in doing all of this, agrobiodiversity, preserving biodiversity is absolutely critical, important. It should unite all of us. But if we don't put in everything we do the lens of social justice, equity, then we're probably not going to get anywhere. So these new avenues of food systems transformation will open a lot of room if we do things right for the marginalized, for the smaller producers, etc. And we need to really take them in mind in designing this, because if we don't solve these big equity gaps that we're seeing, especially around extreme poverty, it's going to be very difficult to then foresee a better future and world for all of us.
Thank you for ending on that point. Incredibly important. And thank you everyone for participating. We will make the video available, and please come to some of the upcoming talks as well. Thanks, Juan Lucas, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you all. It was a nice conversation, and we are there to support in any way. Thanks a lot.